For more than 2 years, we have been experiencing that pandemics can change our lives in extreme ways and turn the world upside down. Corona is not the first pandemic, though, that caused death, chaos, and destruction to millions of people. In this video, we will show you the most destructive pandemics in human history. We'll explain their treacherous secrets and demonstrate how societies have dealt with them. Justinian Plague, the apocalyptic tragedy ended antiquity. It's the year 542 AD. In Constantinople, the flourishing capital of the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian I, a disease starts to spread with tremendous speed that knows no mercy. Probably imported from Egypt, according to the ancient historian Procopius of Caesarea, it causes swellings all over the body to those affected. Quickly, they cause terrible pain that feel like a burning fire. Some die on the day of the first symptoms. Others are covered with black blisters after several days of agony. Today, we are certain that this is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which 800 years later was also triggering the so-called Black Death. But the Justinian Plague didn't occur in a single case. Over the next 200 years, until the year 770, it brought unbelievable destruction to the citizens of Europe in 18 different waves. Procopius reported up to 10,000 deaths each day in Constantinople alone, which was a city with 500,000 inhabitants at the time. According to today's estimates, the plague killed between 20 and 60% of the entire population. In order to stop this cruel epidemic, superstitious rites have been practiced, such as throwing crockery out of the windows, in addition to isolation, the eradication of public life, and the abandonment of regular burials. This caused hills of corpses and mass graves in larger cities. Hope for the help from heaven, especially from the Mother of God, was omnipresent. Along with natural disasters, the Justinian Plague led to the decline of the Eastern Roman Empire and to the age of antiquity as a whole. Black Death. Even worse than its name suggests, the great return of the deadly plague bacterium took place in 1346, when, according to today's knowledge, it found its way to Europe via trade routes from Central Asia and due to sea trade. The extent of the mortality was simply unimaginable. By 1353, within only 7 years, Yersinia pestis had wiped out a third of the European population, equivalent to 25 million people. Infected by flea bites, rodents, and in the case of pneumonic plague, droplet infection, sufferers perished in a very short period of time. Within 2 to 6 days of infection, their bodies became covered with plague sores, followed by death from internal bleeding, exhaustion, and heart failure. Soon, Jews were blamed for the horrors of the plague as alleged well poisoners, leading to the senseless extermination of entire Jewish communities. Other measures, such as magical practices, amulets, and reliquaries, weren't effective either, just like the prayers in overcrowded churches, which turned into super spreaders of the Middle Ages. Particularly gruesome were numerous flagellants running en masse throughout the street, striking each other with sharp whips in an attempt to obtain God's forgiveness, and alongside with it, an end to the plague. Nonetheless, there were also effective restrictions such as official quarantine regulations, curfews, and the closure of public institutions, which helped to bring an end to this horror. Entire cities were cut off, sufferers have been separated from the healthy, and trade routes were interrupted in order to contain the spread of Yersinia pestis. The first global pandemic, the Russian flu. From 1889 to 1895, humanity had to experience painfully that globalization also had its downsides. During these years, the Russian flu, which caused large number of cases in St. Petersburg for the first time and afflicted 10% of the population, raged across the globe and spread with never-seen speed through railway lines. Despite its name, the pandemic may have been triggered by a coronavirus. Typical characteristics such as cold symptoms, a high risk to the elderly, and in the worst-case scenario, death from pneumonia seem very familiar these days. In particular, its long-term consequences, which included exhaustion and a loss of smell and taste, give the long COVID-like pandemic a widely feared reputation. On the other hand, the mortality rate was limited. Roughly 1 million people died in several waves worldwide between 1889 and 1895, but the case mortality of 0.1 to 0.28% was minimal compared to the Black Death. School and factory closures as well as contact restrictions helped once again to contain the virus, even though there was no vaccine against it. The disease, which was treated with increasing indifference among the population after the first wave, came to a standstill due to a widespread contagion that gave the population a high level of immunity during the 6 years of the pandemic. The deadliest pandemic ever. The Spanish flu. Right after the destructive chaos of the First World War, another pandemic rolled over humanity, which, with an estimated 20 to 100 million deaths between 1918 and 1920, was the most devastating of all time in terms of numbers, the so-called Spanish flu. Nowadays, we assume that the suspected origin was in the U.S. state of Kansas. The pandemic triggered by the influenza virus only got its name because it was first reported in Spain. Other countries had feared that bad news about deadly diseases could negatively affect the morale of the people right after the war. Yet the Spanish flu was far more deadly than World War I. Sufferers complained of a sudden onset with high fever and aching limbs, often followed after a few days by death from heart muscle and lung infections. Sick in the morning, dead in the evening was a common and frightening report of many military doctors who had to witness their patients struggle. One thing has to be pointed out. This pandemic mainly affected young and healthy people between 20 and 40 years of age, and led to an aging of societies on a global scale. The faster the response, the more successful the containment was, though. In New York City, where isolation and quarantine rules and the closure of subways and schools occurred 11 days before an observed increase in mortality, the extent of the flu was successfully contained. Other cities, such as Pittsburgh, that reacted too late, experienced dramatic death tolls. Occasionally, vaccines also brought a mitigation of the courses, but on a large scale, vaccinations weren't very efficient yet due to the state of science at the time. The pandemic that never existed, the swine flu. It is spring 2009, and one topic dominates the German news, the swine flu, triggered by the H1N1 influenza virus. Despite its strong media presence, the disease, which originated in Mexico and was transmitted to human beings by pigs, turned out to be relatively harmless. From June 2009 to August 2010, it was declared a pandemic by the WHO, though killing around 20,000 people worldwide, but without the cause of a devastating effect in the U.S. either. According to data from the RKI, around 226,000 cases occurred in this country, of which only 258 patients died. Contamination spread via droplet and smear infection. After an incubation period of 1 to 3 days, patients experienced typical flu symptoms such as chills, headache, and aching limbs, combined with nausea and diarrhea. Similar to the Spanish flu, young and healthy people were increasingly affected by this summer epidemic. Negative headlines have been written about the rapidly developed vaccine Pandemrix, which contained yet unproven effect enhancers and triggered narcolepsy in children. The Swedish government paid those affected up to 1 million euros in compensation. After the pandemic ended, this vaccine lost its credibility and was destroyed in large quantities. In Germany, the vaccination rate was only about 8%. Restrictions on public life have not been implemented due to the relative harmlessness, and 1 year later, in 2011, nobody really talked about swine flu any longer. From HIV to AIDS, the fatal decline of the immune system. The first evidence of HIV was found in 1960 in the Congo. The disease became famous worldwide at the beginning of the 1980s. Contrary to the widespread assumption that it is a new phenomenon of the 1980s, the acquired immunodeficiency disease, which is primarily transmitted through unprotected sexual intercourse, has probably existed since the beginning of the 20th century. What makes the disease, the consequences of which killed around 680,000 people worldwide in 2020, so dangerous is its treacherous course. 2 to 4 weeks after infection, flu-like symptoms appear. Then they fade again and are often not noticeable for years. Later, it is followed by a permanent weakening of the immune system, which leads to AIDS after about 10 years. The next escalation phase causes life-threatening diseases like cancer and pneumonia, giving untreated sufferers a remaining median survival time of only 18 months after the incubation period of 10 years. The good news is that modern treatment methods are so effective that patients do not have to expect a reduction in their life expectancy. Persistent problems associated with HIV are discrimination and stigmatization. Homosexual men in particular were initially considered to be the sole cause of the disease, which was referred to as gay cancer and GRID, gay-related immune deficiency, due to its rapid spread in the gay scene. Today, HIV is combated primarily through testing, education campaigns, and further developed diagnostic and therapeutic methods. There are sad statistics, though. Since its discovery, more than 36 million people have died as a result of HIV. The pandemic with an uncertain outcome, SARS-CoV-2. The latest of all pandemics has been turning the world upside down since early 2020. It has its origins in the Chinese metropolis of Wuhan, where a new form of the coronavirus, which presumably jumped from bats to humans, appeared for the first time in December 2019, SARS-CoV-2. Due to its strong transmissibility via aerosols and droplet infections, the virus is considered highly contagious and unfolds its danger especially in elderly people with weak immune systems. Therefore, the disease leads not only to cough, fever, and cold, but in extreme cases to fatal respiratory failure. The worldwide mortality rate is considered to be between 1 and 1.5%, so that as of April 2022, 6 million of the 500 million people infected have died as a result of COVID-19. To contain the pandemic, the global community implemented restrictions on everyday life that no one has experienced for generations. Curfews, distance rules, masking requirements, and nationwide lockdowns have affected public life in several waves. We do not yet know how the pandemic will end. At present, virologists consider a gradual transition to an endemic state to be the most likely scenario. Now it's up to you. Which pandemic impressed you the most? How do you judge people's reactions to the major pandemics? We are looking forward to your comments. If you want to see more history videos about the most exciting eras of humanity, don't forget to subscribe so you will never miss on any exciting video. See you next time.